Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. I will be presenting the political framing. So I would also just like to invite, thank you all for inviting ACB to be part of this panel, to be among friends as we continue in solidarity to push against the current corporate hegemony of our food and seed systems, particularly under the United Nations Food System Summit. Now, before I begin, I would like to express solidarity with the people of South Africa and the crisis that engulfed the country in the last weeks, but also to the rest of the continent where structural challenges related to authoritarianism, inequality, ecological crisis, and the constant looting of our governments continue to impact our African people. Our heart goes out to you as we continue with the struggles for emancipation for our continent. I would like to start my talk by situating it in the current state of play on the African continent, which involves Africa's experiences of the intersecting ecological, economic, social, and democratic crisis. Now, as we all know, the African region is hardest hit by impacts of climate crisis and is bound to experience this crisis in the coming future. In addition, the continent is also facing a multitude of intersecting shocks, such as those related to climate, such as drought and flooding, as we have seen in Southern Africa, Mozambique, Zambia, and Malawi, which are ravaged by Cyclone Idai. We've also seen the spread of fall armyworm and locust infestations in Africa, in East and then Horn of Africa. We've seen the outbreak of Ebola in West and Central Africa, and we are also currently living in a global pandemic of COVID-19. But these shocks, the impacts that these shocks actually have on African smallholder farmers and rural populations is also shaped by economics. In particular, African problems in our key sectors such as agriculture, among others, are deeply rooted in its subordination in the world economy, neocolonialism, a large part of which is austerity measures imposed by the likes of IMF and the World Bank in favor of capital, thus deepening indebtedness and contributing to crumbling states. Now, at the same time, the state is often complicit in taking loans from IMF and World Bank and from new range of actors, which through corruption often become sources of accumulation of wealth for elites. Now, among the deep political problems in Africa is the state failure to support the flourishing of agriculture and smallholder farmers in the context of neocolonialism and which has led to weak and depleted agricultural sectors in which a majority of women, smallholder farmers feed Africa. This state of weakened agriculture and often poor democratic relationships between state and citizenry provides one of the openings for corporations to advance the increasing agendas, of increasing the market power and control with very little pushback from affected populations as a result of democratic deficits. The advance of corporate agriculture is, as we see with the current United Nations Food System Summit, posed as genuine solutions to the problems of African agriculture. Yet, the average smallholder farmer has had little input in defining their content. Now, this is a very important context against which we need to understand the advance of corporate seed laws on the continent. Now, the capitalist capture of the agriculture has led governments to put in place systems such as policies and laws with limited or lack of public consultation, failing to include affected interest groups in decision-making, and in particular small-scale and community food producers in urban and rural areas, and other people involved in food systems. There is also non-compliance with the International Human Rights Declaration, such as the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and also agreements such as the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. As a result, it is difficult for communities to engage with decision makers, and further, these groups are utterly marginalized politically, economically, and socially, despite administrative justice enshrined in most African governments' national constitution. Now, seed policies and laws exist within a dualistic seed system, where on one hand, we have a tiny but highly formalized commercial seed system, and on the other hand, we have a significant, diverse farmer-managed seed system, which is largely unsupported, despite it producing most of the seed and the food that we consume on the continent. Now, the current seed and intellectual property protection laws are thus instruments that support and continue to entrench industrial agriculture and the reinforcement of indebtedness, inequality, social exclusion, and ecological crises such as climate change, biodiversity loss and degradation, pest infestations and deforestation, among others. Now, as a result, in the case of emerging political or socio-ecological crises, such as we are experiencing on the continent, the most vulnerable, poor, and marginalized are hugely impacted socially and economically due to the push and adoption of false corporate solutions and the lack of real solutions rooted in local structures and grassroots communities. Now, we must be very clear that seed laws do not contain measures to safeguard the diversity on farm and the continued maintenance of heterogeneous seed in farmer-managed seed systems, which is so vital to ensure food sovereignty and resilient food systems. Autonomy over seed is a prerequisite and core component of the exercise of rights by family and community farmers and peasants. Complete autonomy. Protections are needed against patents, plant variety protection laws, digital sequence information, and the like. These are calculated to erode the exercise of farmers' rights. We must also be very clear that plant variety protection laws are commercial laws. They do not and should not surpass farmers' rights, which are human rights, including the rights to food and nutrition, and are linked to a bundle of other rights recognized by several United Nations declarations, as I have mentioned earlier. We must assert the primacy of farmers' rights as a human right in its own right. We must insist that African governments must expressly recognize farmers' rights to seed, and seed practices as necessary building blocks for our struggles for transformation towards seed and food sovereignty. We must work towards protecting and expanding territorial markets, towards ensuring local and community markets for farmer seed crops and produce, including also inter alia public procurement programs built around diverse crops for food and nutrition security programs. Most importantly, we must recognize that farmers' rights is not just about the protection of genetic diversity and household food security. We need to advance a conception of farmers' rights grounded in a wider vision of food sovereignty that is linked to a whole view of the food system that encompasses those living in cities and towns who have rights to nutritious and culturally appropriate food, and which sees seed as both a part and a potential enabler of deepened social relationships that form the basis for working together to build better societies grounded in ecological and social justice. And I would like to conclude by thanking all the social movements, academics, NGOs, and others who have worked so hard to put this counter summit together. It has brought together all of us who care about valuing ourselves as human beings, learning to value others, and learning to value and care for the environment in which one develops themselves. We are all committed to a world where individuals' well-being can be achieved through harmonious relationships with the wider community, including people, the environment, other living beings, their ancestors, and the cosmos. We embrace food sovereignty, land rights, environmental justice, economic solidarity, and the protection of local biodiversity. We are vehemently opposed to capitalist consumerism and aspire for global democratic societies where happiness and leading a meaningful life is not bound by material accumulation. Rather, we embrace harmony between human beings and also between human beings and nature, as we are nothing without each other and without the natural world.